Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome once again to another edition of the Karima live stream. Last week, alhamdulillah, we hosted Imam Zaid Shakir speaking about why Malcolm matters, and we advertised today's event where we'll be talking about the history of Islam in China and then focusing today a lot more on the current situation with the Uyghur population in East Turkestan. And we spoke just this Jumu'ah recently about the idea that one of the crises that we're facing as a Muslim population in the West is this sort of what we call the pandemic of loneliness that the Western population itself is facing. And one of the things is the Ummah by extension, by living here, is also facing this. And one of the things that we have is we, as a Muslim population in the West, have become very disconnected from the vast population of Muslims in other lands. And so what we're going to try and do today is to sort of reconnect, like the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Muslimuna kal-bunyan yashuddu ba'duhu ba'da, that the believers are like a building. Each part supports the other part. And this is our attempt to sort of reconnect that support that the Ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam always traditionally had, and as in recent times has fragmented in a very traumatic way. And this is a very important issue, and these are very important. The idea that the Prophet ﷺ said that أَشَدُّكُمْ بَلَاءً الْأَنْبِيَاء ثُمَّ الْأَمْثَلُ فَالْأَمْثَلُ, that the most severely tested of all of you are the prophets, and then those that most resemble them, and then those that most resemble them. And there's an idea in our tradition that people who undergo suffering and tribulation are blessed people. And so by mentioning the people of blessings, we attain their blessings also. And also the recognition that there is responsibility and burden on our shoulders, that we have to present ma'adhiratan ila rabbikum, an excuse to our Lord on the Day of Judgment, and an excuse for why we were silent. And so inshallah, this is our attempt to speak out for people who are struggling to speak because they have been shackled by oppressors. And so we are joined today, alhamdulillah, by Sister Aydin Anwar, who will give a more lengthy introduction before she speaks, inshallah, and Ustad AbdulRahman Latif, who will be exploring a lot of the issues that we are going to speak about. But we'll start off, inshallah ta'ala, with the recitation of the Book of Allah, a short tilawah from the Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أم حسبتم أن تدخلوا الجنة ولما يأتكم مثل الذين خلوا من قبلكم مستهم البأساء والضراء وزلزلوا حتى يقول الرسول والذين آمنوا معه متى نصر الله ألا إن نصر الله قريب يسألونك ماذا ينفقون قل ما أنفقتم من خير فللوالدين والأقربين واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل وما تفعلوا من خير فإن الله به عليم كتب عليكم القتال وهو كره لكم وعسى أن تكرهوا شيئا وهو خير لكم وعسى أن تحبوا شيئا وهو شر لكم والله يعلم وأنتم لا تعلمون. صدق الله العظيم. That Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran that do you think that you will enter the garden of paradise and you will not have or be reached by that which reached the people before you, that they were afflicted with trials, poverty, hardship, and were shaken until even their messenger and those who believed with him said, "When is the help of Allah going to come? Indeed, the help of Allah is near." They ask you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, about what they should spend. Say, whatever you spend of good is for your parents and relatives, and the orphans and the needy and the traveler, and whatever you do of good, indeed Allah knows of it. Fighting and struggling has been enjoined upon you while it is hateful or disliked to you. But perhaps you dislike a thing and it is good for you, and perhaps you love a thing and it is bad for you, and Allah knows while you know not. And Allah speaks the truth. So inshallah, I will start by introducing our first speaker. Ustad AbdulRahman is a PhD student in religion at Columbia University. He's currently working on the idea of traditional Muslim storytelling and translation practices. I have a memory that he has done some traditional study as well with ulama and mashayikh. I was in Turkey and I remember he was studying some of the ulum Islamiyya with some of the scholars there as well. And inshallah, he will be speaking to us about the history of Islam in China. And I think there will be a slight focus on the Uyghur population and how they came to be Muslim as well. Over to you, Ustad AbdulRahman.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. So inshallah, actually, it's an honor to be with you today and to talk about this heavy but important issue. So I'm not going to talk about the history of Islam in China per se. I'm going to talk about the history of Uyghur Muslims in East Turkestan or modern-day Xinjiang, the region in northwest China. The reason I'm kind of separating the two out is because Uyghurs and the other Turkic populations in East Turkestan have historically not been a part of China. The history of Islam in China largely revolves around the Uyghur Muslims, who have a rich and complicated history that's very much integrated with other parts of the Muslim world in its own ways. But it is, until the modern period, it is a relatively separate history from the history of the Uyghurs, which is the history that we're going to be talking about here today. So just first of all, to introduce the subject matter, this talk I'm going to be giving now is a much shorter, streamlined version of a longer presentation. I'll send you, inshallah, the link to the longer video if anyone is interested. But first of all, just to kind of limit our subject area, so East Turkestan or Xinjiang or Al-Jifiri, as it's called in different historical sources, is this particular region you can see on the map over here, highlighted in light blue. As you can see, it's very close to Kashmir. It's connected directly with the rest of Central Asia. As we'll see in our discussion here today, this region has historically been connected with the wider Muslim cultural sphere, with the wider Central Asian cultural sphere, more so even than it has been, except for the modern period, with the sort of Chinese cultural sphere and linguistic connections, etc. So first of all,
sorry, Ustad
yes.
AbdulRahman, could you just put it on presentation mode so that we can?
Yeah. Can everyone see that then?
That's perfect.
Okay, this area over here. So just before I really get started, I just want to clarify why we're talking about this sort of history. As Muslims, we have an obligation to care about other Muslims, regardless of what we know of their history or not. The fact that someone is Muslim, the fact that someone is human and is being oppressed in any way is enough for us to care. Allah says in the Quran, stand for appropriate justice, regardless of the circumstances, even if it's against your own self. That being said, this is a rich and powerful and inspiring history that we should learn from. And furthermore, the Chinese government has made quite the effort to erase this history. When a people's history is erased, it's easier to erase the people themselves. This is part of the package of genocide that's occurring now against the Muslims in this region. So it's important for us to remember the history with that in mind, inshallah. So I'd like to get started by talking about the legendary background of Islam in the region and amongst the Uyghurs. So Islam first entered this area in the 8th century under the Umayyads. There was a local Umayyad conquest of Kashgar, the central city in the region, but it didn't really last. Muslims kind of lost their stronghold very quickly. There were no lasting roots of Islam in the region from this time period. It wasn't until the 10th century that we started seeing the long-term inroads of Islam in the region under the Karakhanid dynasty. The Karakhanids were a 10th, 11th century dynasty that kind of operated under the aegis of the Abbasid Empire. So during this time period, the Abbasids had no meaningful political power, but there's a sort of symbolic authority that the Qarakhanids assented to. And the Qarakhanids became Muslim and were essentially founded by this legendary figure named Satuq Bughra Khan, who died in 955 CE. So Satuq Bughra Khan, the stories about him are hagiographical in nature. There's saintly biographies about this figure. And as historians, we're generally very skeptical about these sorts of texts, about what they actually tell us about the time period. But they can say a lot about what people view about themselves and their own history and what's important to them from these narratives. And furthermore, as a Muslim, as a believer, we can find inspiration and power in these narratives. So to give a very, very brief, condensed version, there are translations of this work out that I can highly recommend and maybe send to people if they're interested. It's a very powerful, narrative. But Satuq Bughra Khan was this figure in, the chieftain family of this tribal confederation, and the family was very pagan. And he's traveling one day and he encounters one of these Samanid Muslims. The Samanids were another Muslim dynasty in Central Asia. And he sees, a prayer happening. He starts to ask about this prayer. He becomes enchanted by this. And, the individual he encounters starts to teach him about Islam. And eventually he accepts Islam and becomes Muslim. But he knows that his family and the wider tribal confederation is very against the idea of Muslims, against the idea of Islam. So he's told to practice secretly. And he teaches his companions about Islam after he himself converts in secret. But when he comes back, his relative, this big tribal chieftain, his uncle or some other relative, is afraid that he's become Muslim and he wants to challenge him. So he tells Satuq Bughra Khan, I want you to build this idol temple for me. I want you to be in charge of the construction, essentially saying that if he refuses, he'll kill him. So Satuq Bughra Khan has this dilemma, as any Muslim would, like to build something that's a place of putrid idolatry. What is he going to do? So he makes the intention as he starts constructing that actually he's building a mosque. He says he looks like I'm building an idol temple, but Allah, I'm building with intention of actually I'm building a mosque. This will become a mosque someday. That's my intention. And he builds, and the suspicion is kind of lifted from him. And then afterwards, he manages to find, more power, more allies, and he stages a revolt. He eventually becomes the chieftain of the group, and he, converts people to Islam and expands Islam in the territories, beyond its boundaries. And this story I find to be very important, for us to think about, because it's about a people, about a Muslim who had to hide his faith and then eventually found power, very much like many of the companions of the time of Rasulullah, but also about like Uyghurs today, where Islam is under threat, it is under oppression constantly in this region today. People are forced to hide their faith. They're not able to practice openly, but still the flame of the faith survives. And inshallah ta'ala, once again, it will come and be ablaze once more. So the Qarakhanids, as I mentioned, were operating under the Abbasid Empire. And we can see from this is a coin. This is a Qarakhanid coin from, I think, Yarkand, which is a region in the southern part of East Turkestan today, or of Al-Jifiri, Xinjiang today. And this coin of the Qarakhanids is very much, for those that are familiar with numismatics, the study of coins, it's very much a typical Abbasid coin. The way the coin looks, the Arabic that's there, the Quranic inscriptions around it, it's very, very typical for Muslim coins of the time period, which tells us again how much the sort of symbols of the Muslims had penetrated into this region. A coin kind of represents to us, what is meaningful in terms of authority and understanding for the population. You see the queen's face, it's forgive me for remembering the names. It's a pence or whatever it is. You can tell these are recognizable symbols of authority. So these symbols of Islam were very much recognizable in the region during this time period immediately. But there was also a local twist that was occurring. So for those that understand Arabic or can read Arabic, you might notice at the very bottom over here, if it's visible in purple, this is not Arabic. It's written in Arabic script, but what it says is not an Arabic phrase. It's actually Old Uyghur. It's the old version of the local language, written in the Arabic script, however, which shows that Islamic symbols, the sort of universal idea of Islamic authority, is accepted, but there is a local twist. There's a bit of indigenization within this paradigm, which we see very commonly as Islam spreads to different regions. During the Qarakhanid Empire, in the 11th and early 12th century, we see several flourishings of great literary and scholarly figures. So I'll just highlight two of them very briefly. Yusuf Khas Hajib wrote a book called Qutad Bilig. So Qutad Bilig is a mirror for princes text. That is, it's a text that's geared towards shaping notions of justice and etiquette and ethics in a ruler. But it's more than just a typical mirror for Princess text. Also argue it's a mirror for the soul text. What I mean by this is that this text is not just oriented towards fashioning the ruler's sense of justice, but his entire sort of spiritual reality. It's very much infused with tazkiyah, with the tasawwuf. I won't go into details because of time, but there are translations available. It's a very, very powerful text in the way it's told. The entire thing is told in Masnavi format. So it's a poem of, I think, almost 6,000 lines, 6,000 couplets. Very, very powerful text. I'll skip these quotes, but during Q&A, if anybody wants to pursue them, we can. The second figure during the Karakhanids who is extremely notable, in the history of Muslim scholarly production is Mahmud Qashqari. So Mahmud Qashqari wrote a work called Diwan Lughat al-Turk, and this text was written in Arabic. He actually migrated to the Seljuk domain, and he wrote it, for the Arabic speakers to kind of learn a bit about the Turkic languages. So essentially, this work was a lexicon where it had, details of different dialects of the Turkic languages, and also details about geography, anecdotes about different regions. We can say, some scholars say, this is the first known work of aerial linguistics. Especially in the history of linguistics, it's a very important work. And the work is most famous, again, having to move a little bit fast unfortunately because of time, it's most famous for a map in the center of the work where Mahmud Qashqari kind of documented the world at his time period. So we can see the map over here, and you can see a translated version over here. It is very much like a traditional Muslim map. Traditional Islamic maps at the time period were circular, and it includes all the traditional landscapes, Khorasan, Iraq, Hijaz. The difference is what he puts in the center. So he puts in the center the Karakhanid domain, right, which at that time was centered in Balkhan, I think, which is in somewhere around modern Kazakhstan or somewhere in that region. And the reason he does this is because, again, he's taking this Islamic perception of the world, but he's centering his locality. He's making his locality a center. It's not a periphery of the Muslim world. In many ways, it's a center of the Muslim world as well. So we can see that in the creation of this map. After the Karakhanids, different dynasties, different periods of rule occurred, but we see there's very concrete evidence, into the 13th century that Islamic sciences and Islamic literary paradigms on a wider scale were very much prevalent in the region. So Sadi Shirazi, who I think many of you may know, especially those of South Asian background, was one of the most famous Persian poets and literateurs ever. He is also incredibly important in the history of literature of Tasawwuf. His works, the Gulistan and Bustan, are poetic and prose works that kind of encapsulate the Sufi ethics for generations. And these works, especially the Gulistan, is still read until this day. Read everywhere from the Balkans to the Bengal. It's one of the most significant texts in Islamic history. So in the text of Gulistan, Sadi Shirazi talks about a visit he made to Kashgar. Kashgar, again, being this central scholarly city in East Turkestan. And he talks in the story about going to the masjid, and he sees a circle of students studying Arabic grammar. So this shows us that during this time period, the Islamic sciences, which always begin with the grammar and the linguistic sciences, were prevalent and present in this region. And he has a conversation with these students, and eventually they talk about Persian poetry. So immediately he makes a connection that it's not just that they have this sort of Islamic scholarly paradigm present, but also the literary sphere of the Persianate is also present within this region. And it's very appropriate, I find, that this anecdote that he tells about his interaction with these students revolves around friendship, around camaraderie. He talks about a friendship that he strikes up with one of these young scholars in training. And I think this is very important for us to think about today, that what binds us as Muslim is our faith and this notion of justice. But Allah Ta'ala has inspired in the hearts of believers immediately this sort of potential for affection and care on the level of friendship. Immediately, you meet another Muslim, as Sadi did with this young youth in Kashgar, and you can make that sort of connection immediately. So Allah Ta'ala, inshallah, form those bonds between us and also give us that level of care for our brothers and sisters who are suffering. We see, beginning in the late Karakhanid period and into the present day, that there were several authors in East Turkestan or stemming from this region who wrote in Arabic, who wrote works of tasawwuf, who wrote works on adab, on usul, who were several predominant authors. This is just a look at authors from Kashgar, not even the entire region, just Kashgar. One of them who's especially significant, passed away in the 8th century, early 8th century Hijri, was Imam Abu Abdullah Sadid al-Din Muhammad bin Muhammad al-Qashqari. Those who studied Hanafi fiqh may be aware of him. His Mughni al-Musalli wal Ghani al-Muqtadi is a major work of Hanafi fiqh that was commented on as far away as Syria. So again, it's significant in the history of Islamic scholarly production, and especially in Hanafi production. Now, in the 13th century, the region was conquered by the Mongols. The Mongols conquered much of the Muslim world during this time period. And the Mongols divided themselves into 4 kind of khaganates, 4 sort of distinct empires under this grand aegis of the Mongols. And the Chagatai Khanate was located in the area which is now East Turkestan. And so it also encompassed a wider territory, but this was a central part of the area. And traditional narratives tell us that it was the local shuyukh of this region who ended up converting the Mongol Khan to Islam. And because of time, I won't tell this story. But again, during question and answers, if there's any interest in hearing the story, I'm happy to tell it. Many of you may have heard it before. It's actually a very famous story of the local sheikh of the lost city of Satuq in the Taklamakan desert, who converted Timur Tughlaq Khan to Islam. It's a very beautiful, very powerful story. So we see the Mongols themselves became Muslim, and actually under the late Mongol period of this region, Islam flourished even more, and we see significant Islamization, especially in the north during that time period. After the Mongols and the series of successive dynasties, etc., another notable point in the history of the region is the rise of Chagatai, Turkish. So Chagatai is a Turkic language that is the ancestor of modern Uyghur and Uzbek, that is related to Ottoman Turkish and modern Turkish. We see a sort of rise of this language in the 15th, 16th century. And this was especially done under the descendants of the Timurids. And the notable figure, in the region, in the systemization of this language, is Mir Ali Shir Navai. Mir Ali Shir Navai was a noted follower of Jami, in the Naqshbandi order, famous translator, scholar in his own right, and political minister as well. And because of time, I won't go into some of these details, but he's just one example of this wide, impressive Islamic literature that developed in this hybrid literary language. But we see that the people of East Turkestan were very much an heir to this intellectual and literary tradition. There are several texts of these authors. There's several works written in this language that are preserved, especially in this region. And also we see in the 16th century that there were these transnational links that were not just developed during this time period, but clearly present during this time period. So Muhammad Sharif was a 16th century Sufi sheikh from the region around Yarkand. Originally, he was from modern-day Uzbekistan. He migrated to Yarkand in East Turkestan. And it's said that he went on a journey to the Hajj. And in the sort of hagiographical narrative of his journey, he actually passes through Surat in modern-day Gujarat, where my family is from, actually. And it goes to show that there's a sort of, international connection of Muslims during that time period. One region was not disconnected from another, not just in a sort of scholarly exchange, but also on the level of material and personal kind of exchange and movement. And Muhammad Sharif becomes very important in the history of the region because he starts this practice, revives this practice of kind of finding the tombs of different shuyukh and mighty figures of the region and kind of exalting them and making them sites of ziyarah back in East Pakistan. And we see even into the present day, until modern Chinese oppression really cracking down upon it, that these sites of different saints were places of constant visitation and historical remembrance for the people of this region. And it goes to show that Islam is something that is both alive on top of the soil in our deeds and our actions, but also in our dead, our deceased. It's buried into the soil. This duality of physical presence above land, but also seeds in the ground below land, seeds of barakah and below land, what make a land Muslim, what make it last as Muslim. So as much as the modern Chinese government may try and destroy this region, Islam is still in the soil. It's in the very soil of this region, the very character and identity of this region. We also see, beginning in the 16th century and into the present day, especially into the 19th century, there was a wide corpus of poetic and musical literature that developed called the 12 muqams. The 12 muqams are the cycle, basically they're a cycle or series of traditional musical performances with the traditional instruments of the region, and they are infused with the ethos of divine love and contemplation and discussions of divine unity. So we see references to Layla and Majnun, to Yusuf and Zulaykha throughout this sort of tradition. It becomes very, very prominent within this tradition. And there's some of the most beautiful, poems in the local languages. I can, inshallah, send recommendations for a book if anyone is interested in knowing more. Also, in this region, we see, in the 17th century, especially and onwards, the Naqshbandi order became particularly powerful in this region. There were other Sufi orders that were active, but the Naqshbandis in particular had a lot of sway in this region. So during the 18th century, in the middle of the 18th century, the Qing Manchu dynasty, this predecessor to the modern Chinese state, conquered East Turkestan. And this is when it got the name Xinjiang. This is when it began to be called Xinjiang, which means new territory. So essentially, it was a colonial imperial territory of this foreign kind of empire, if you will. And there were Chinese administrators appointed over the region. But even during this time period, Muslims were constantly resisting. And the common resistors were this family, actually, of Maqdum al-Adam. So Maqdum al-Adam was a predominant Naqshbandi sheikh. So his descendants, called the Apak Khojas, were very active in resistance movements against the Chinese states. They were kind of alternative loci of power against this modern state. And eventually, in the 19th century, for the period of several years, Yaqub Beg, who was kind of affiliated in some sort of ways with this Khoja, but sort of independent, who came from another area in wider Turkestan, came and established a independent Muslim territory in Kashmir, kind of a revival of Muslim sovereignty in the region. And this became in many ways a predecessor for modern ideas of Muslim unity and autonomy in the region. So Yaqub Beg was the central figure. And it was during Yaqub Beg's time period, actually, that we see significant literary production. And we see even into the late 19th century, early 20th century, as the Chinese oppression reasserted itself in the region, that there were several texts established on the history of Islam and Muslims and Muslim scholarly production. So the Jarring collection is a collection of literature from this region, mostly written in Chagatai, but not solely, that's located in Sweden. And we can see just from a short sample of some of the works in this collection, most of which are digitized, freely available online, that we have, poetic works of the great Naqshbandi Sheikh Ahmed Yasavi, for example. We have works on the Miraj, works on the Prophet ﷺ, works on Futuwa, this Sufi chivalry, that are present in this collection that are written in this local language. And these texts were produced mostly in the late 19th, early 20th century, although they stem often from much older texts. We can see poetic renderings of Jami's Yusuf and Zulaykha texts, translations of Al-Ghazali's Kimiyat al-Sa'adat into the local language of Layla wa Dimna. These texts that are known across the Muslim world were also present in this region and localized, translated, and commonly read. We also see saintly biographies of figures like Abdul Qadir Jilani, Ibrahim bin Adham, these international Muslim figures, as well as local figures like Jalaluddin al-Qattaqi, Satuq Khan, and others. So just very quickly, some takeaways from this mostly pre-modern history of the region. East Turkestan was simultaneously self-consciously Islamic, part of the Ummah, but also in tune with local identity without contradictions. This region was part of the Persianate literary sphere, and the Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples of the region are direct inheritors of Chagatai, one of the great languages of Islamic civilization. Babur, the first Mughal emperor, wrote his memoirs actually in this language of Chagatai. And this region was firmly connected with the rest of Islamdom and both networks of people and object. The Islamic sciences were alive and well, and the land was made sacred by the burial and remembrance of the saints of the region. With that, inshallah ta'ala, I will conclude. I'm sorry for moving fast, but there was a lot to cover, and I'm sorry for skipping over materials. Inshallah ta'ala, Sister Aydin can tell you about the modern period and the current struggles that are ongoing today. Jazakumullah khair.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Ustad AbdulRahman. I think it's incredibly interesting. And I think for lots of Muslims, we may well have heard some history, from those kind of regions, but most of our history really is what may well have happened in the Arab world, and then possibly even the subcontinent. I don't know if anyone has any questions online. Feel free to post in the comments, and we'll try to ask Ustad AbdulRahman. But before Sister Aydin presents, I wondered if I could ask a question. I don't know if Molana you had any, but if I could maybe just start with, so just on that period, and again, the incredible history, but just on that period where the first, I suppose, part of the occupation begins.
it's very much about occupying the land and trying to take the resources. So and it's particularly sort of the northwest from China going upwards. Was there Chinese incursions elsewhere as well?
So I should specify that this entire region during the mid 18th century was occupied by China. There was actually another kind of late Mongol relative power that had taken over part of the territory for a while, and the Qing Manchu defeated them and then kind of took over the region. And they took over this entire region. So when I speak of East Turkestan, I'm talking about this area from the south, from above the mountains, above Kashmir, all the way towards this kind of northern border with Russia, this entire area. So the Qing authority established itself throughout the region, but especially in the northern part of that region. So the north of the Taklamakan Desert, and that area became significantly more Sinicized, more in line with Chinese cultural civilization because of that, focus on the occupation. So generally speaking, Islam was preserved more thoroughly in the south, and language was preserved more thoroughly in the south because the occupation was mostly centered on the northern area. And this was, we could call this, kind of classical imperial kind of takeover, where there was some degree of autonomy of the local Chinese administrators from the central authority. There was obviously pressure in different ways, but Muslims, for the most part, were still able to practice. It wasn't until the modern period, which Aydin will talk about, that colonial practices kind of magnified, and especially under the modern Chinese state, it very much became classical settler colonialism in line with what's happening in Palestine. Right, it was sort of like constant settling of Chinese residents, but even worse than that, as Sister Aydin will talk about, forced marriages, mass incarceration, basically attempts to stamp out the sort of Muslim presence in the region broadly. And again, just to emphasize what I mentioned in the beginning, so the Uyghur Muslims are another major Muslim population, but they're not kind of associated with a long history of this region the same way. And they are much more Sinicized. So they're a form of Sinicized Islam, one could argue, distinct from Uyghurs. But now, because of the current situation, their histories are more and more intertwined because the Chinese state has started with oppression against the Muslims that are ethnically and culturally different, as the Uyghurs are. And now they're kind of moving towards oppressing the Hui as well. But it's a different sort of, the moves are different, and we can talk more about it if people are interested, but the way that Islam is understood by the Chinese government in regards to both of these traditions is different, and the way they're portrayed to the world is different, even though the differences maybe aren't as much as they seem.
I think one thing I found very powerful, is the idea that this is, sort of the Turkic, Persian, Islamic culture. This is our tradition as well. So Azad Kashmiri Muslims or Kashmiri Muslims, Islam was brought to us by Sayyid Ali Hamdani, a Persian Sufi saint, Bilal Shah. These were, again, and this idea of the mazars and the ziyarah, these are things our people do, the Hanafi tradition, Ghazali's Kimya Siadat. It's something that I think allows a lot of empathy to come in when you have a realization. And obviously our people, the Kashmiri people, are undergoing their own persecution, very similar in its own way. But I think it allows you to empathize a lot more when you realize that how intertwined the history of our people, the Uyghur and the Kashmiris and that general population is. I found that a very powerful idea.
The geography itself is connected. There are just mountains in between. And we can imagine that there was migration in between. And even, anecdotally, I've heard a lot about the architectural practices of Kashmir and especially like the southern regions of East Turkestan being very similar. Clothing practices are quite similar. Even the food.
The way they wear the hijab, the women, the Uyghur women and the ethnic Kashmiri women, their hijab is very similar too.
The style of like kufi that's worn, the doppa versus the topi are quite similar. Even the word itself, I think, comes from Persian. Doppa, topi, they sound very similar. Even the food, like on the level of cuisine, you can see similarities. Samsa and samosa, halvurma, korma, there's these people, like it's multiple ways that there's interconnect. Of course, Islam is the primary way, but there are so many different levels of internet connection between these sorts of regions. It's really like this, again, making this a Chinese region, separating it out from the wider Muslim history is a modern strategy of the state to kind of isolate the Muslims of the area.
100%. Jazakallah for Ustad AbdulRahman. If anybody has any questions, please do put them in the comments, and then inshallah when we have the extended Q&A session, we can probe some areas with Ustad AbdulRahman. Now we move on to Sister Aydin Anwar. She is Uyghur herself, an Uyghur Muslim living in America, and she has over 93 relatives that are missing in Chinese-occupied the East Turkestan area. She has been consistently for the last few years, or maybe even longer, working for Uyghur advocacy, fighting for the rights of the Uyghur population in America. I met her. I attended a workshop she did when I was in Turkey 2 years ago, where she spoke to us about the crisis and the tribulations and the sufferings that our Uyghur brothers and sisters were undergoing in East Turkestan. At that time, she was a student, I think, at Duke University. I mean, she's told us that she's graduated since, and she currently works for CARE Washington as a community outreach fellow, and carries on doing her advocacy work and activism for the Uyghur cause. So, and she's going to speak to us about the current situation in East Turkestan and what our brothers and sisters are facing at the moment, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you everyone for joining in. And thank you, Jazakallah khair, to AbdulRahman for that really detailed and succinct presentation about the pre-modern history. I think I was telling AbdulRahman earlier that there needs to be more emphasis on this section, more particularly because I feel like a lot of people don't know a lot about the history. A lot of people are focusing on the current situation, which is fine and it's great. But at the same time, we also need to understand it in the larger context of this occupation, who we are as a people, our culture, the religion, and just kind of the way we grew as a civilization. I don't think people really are able to grasp that, especially in the Muslim world. I'm assuming, a lot of the audience are probably interested in also hearing more about more about how we as a population have grown and become and have come to the point that we are that we have today. So inshallah, my goal is to kind of briefly cover through that. Unfortunately, there's so much to go through, so I tried my best to try to condense it in digestible amounts. And I have a presentation, so I will share that with you all. 1 second. Okay, so inshallah you guys can see this. So I wanted to share with you all this title slide right here, point out to you that this, what seems like a watercolor painting, is actually stemming from an actual photo that was released by the Chinese government in 2017 on the popular Chinese app called WeChat. It's basically China's version of WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all these social media apps combined into one, and it's monitored by the Chinese government. They posted this photo basically claiming that, these are look at what we're doing to protect you all Chinese citizens from these dangerous men. And these are a group, I'll show you the original photo in just a few slides, inshallah. But to really just kind of encapsulate the way that China is carrying out what they're doing right now, and kind of justifying and actually taking pride in it at the same time is, I feel like, a good way to start this presentation as we enter and discuss exactly how China is carrying out this mass genocide on the people of East Turkestan. And I wanted to give a little bit of context as well into the population, where East Turkestan is on the map. I know AbdulRahman showed that to you all briefly as well, and kind of also encapsulate the size of the land. It's the same size as California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada combined. That's a lot of states. So for those who are not really from the states or maybe forget your geography, I'd encourage you to Google the United States map and look at these states and just have an idea of how big this land is. Maybe you can just take a look at this map and have an idea yourself. But also in terms of population of the Uyghurs, I wanted to point out this discrepancy largely created by the Chinese government. So China reported in 2015 that the Uyghur population is around 11 million. 3 years later, China then said that this population is now 6 to 7 million. Estimates by Uyghur scholars, a lot of us estimate that this is more than 20 million, and this really low number that China is putting out to the world is also their attempt to showcase, or is attempt to lower our numbers on paper as well. So not just through what we're seeing, but also just to the world, just saying kind of minimizing who we are as a people and our greater population. Unfortunately, we don't really have the exact number. I actually don't have the exact number now, but with this genocide taking place we estimate that this number is slowly decreasing, and with the way that China is preventing further births and just making sure that the next population of Uyghurs don't exist, unfortunately this number is now decreasing. So I just wanted to point out this discrepancy in population, just so you have an idea of how big this nation is. And also, keep in mind the name East Turkestan. The name itself implies that this is the land of the Eastern Turks. And you keep it, and also notice how we didn't say, Uyghurstan or something that uses the term Uyghur, because this land is comprises not just of Uyghurs but also of other Turkic ethnic groups as well, like Kyrgyz, Kazakhs, Tatars, Uzbeks, and so on. I want to point that out because a lot of people think that this is just a land for Uyghur people. And a lot of times when you're talking about this occupation, this oppression, a lot of the oppression that we are seeing is actually still targeted towards these other Turkic groups as well. This is the national flag of East Turkestan. Unfortunately, you will never see this flag in East Turkestan itself, because having some type of flag like this would essentially cause you to have a death sentence or be sent to a camp or be executed, whatever it may be. Essentially, a lot of people in East Turkestan have never, if they were born and raised there, have probably never even seen this flag, or or maybe this was discussed or shown in private or through an underground method. But even the term East Turkestan is a provocative term that itself is seen as a quote unquote political. As almost like a political term that incites, that shows that you are in support of quote unquote separatism, or what China calls the three evils: terrorism, extremism, or separatism. So these are the three evils that China uses in order to justify what they're doing, claiming that these people of East Turkestan are prone to these three evils, and therefore we have to do whatever it takes to stop that. So this flag you will most likely won't see in East Turkestan again. You may see it in diaspora, in abroad protests and Uyghur households. But I want to just also point out, this is the same exact, it looks exactly the same as the Turkish flag, but just light blue. I know AbdulRahman went through the history briefly, and I kind of wanted to pick up from where he left off. He mentioned the Manchu Empire invasion in 1759. And then I wanted to kind of go from there and talk about how the Manchu Empire then collapsed in 1911, which then brought nationalist China into power in 1912. And this marked the first official Chinese invasion of East Turkestan. And then from there, we have multiple rebellions that took place. And then this eventually led and was allowed the creation of the first East Turkestan Islamic Republic, which was shortly crushed afterwards by the Chinese state and with the help of the Soviet Union. And then again, even though this was crushed in 1944, a second East Turkestan Republic was formed. And then unfortunately, this only lasted for around 5 years until communist China came to power, marking and basically formally taking over and crushing this republic, and then taking over East Turkestan once again, marking this as the latest occupation. And since then, we've been living under decades of forms of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and systematic. You'll see throughout the decades how it kind of shifted and got more intense. But essentially, this occupation has been ongoing. And unfortunately, it's come to the point where we now have the largest concentration camp system since the Holocaust, in addition to mass surveillance, in addition to complete religious forbiddance, not allowing populations to practice even speak their own language, practice their own religion. And then it's now, unfortunately, just carrying out an actual genocide physically as well. I'm going to talk briefly about the methods that the Chinese state is using to actually physically exterminate the population. I think typically people talk about this genocide as more of a cultural genocide, where our culture is being erased, our language is being erased. But one thing I want to point out that is actually much more than that. And I think for calling it a cultural genocide, it almost downplays a little bit of what is actually happening on the ground. And I encourage you all to really just look into and learn more about how this is more physical genocide, and inshallah I'll be touching on that as well. I just wanted to share with you this photo that marks the establishment of the first East Turkestan Islamic Republic. As you can see, just even through glimpsing through the first couple of rows of people sitting there who are the leaders of this republic, these were also, you know, spearheaded. The independence movement was also spearheaded by ulama, Islamic scholars. Unfortunately, these are all people who were, you know, as a consequence of their actions, you know, they were then either executed or they fled Chinese occupation or the crackdown that they were going to receive shortly after. And I wanted to, because we're short on time, I wanted to share a resource out there for those who want to get more into the history and kind of get a more general idea of maybe what's happening. So a friend and I had co-authored a response to Habib Al-Jifiri, a popular scholar or popular sheikh in the Middle East, who had made some somewhat problematic comments about the East Turkestan issue, you know, claiming things like around half of Uyghurs are Muslim and kind of really delegitimizing the entire occupation and the cause. And so we had tried to we had responded with this article and kind of addressed each of those claims in a, you know, in a way that was as respectful as possible, but also, you know, really shedding light on the issues that were at stake and kind of walking through a lot of, you know, kind of responding back to these claims. So if you guys are interested, you know, I'd encourage you to just Google on Muslim Matters this title, and then you can read more into, and it touches a lot on the history as well. And you can also get some action items as to what you can do to help this issue, inshallah. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the current day situation. Unfortunately, because of time, you know, I wish I could go more into like how, like from decade to decade, how we have gotten to the point we are now. But just to kind of recap, I think one good summary or one good, a big turning point in Uyghur modern history or East Turkestan modern history was kind of incidents, more particularly the 2009 Urumqi uprising that took place, where, you know, there was basically a peaceful protest that ended up becoming, you know, very, very rapidly a protest that was then where the Chinese state got involved. It got quickly violent. The Chinese state was now cracking down on Uyghur protesters, and then eventually it became to the point where even Han citizens and Chinese and Uyghur people were then fighting on the streets, and became again a bloody event where a lot of people died. But ultimately, that event, you know, marked the thousands of Uyghur people being arrested, disappeared. And then from there, China made this effort to really clamp down on the Uyghur population through mass surveillance, and claiming that these people are prone to the war on terror. They're prone to terrorism, and therefore we have to use the war on terror that was launched by the U.S. to crack down on this population. So what you see in front of you is actually an Excel spreadsheet, part of an Excel spreadsheet that I created with my dad to walk through the relatives that we have missing. And this is just from my dad's side, this Excel spreadsheet. Unfortunately, it keeps going, but as you can see, this, you know, you can see the date of birth, the approximate date of birth, and then the details of the case. And if you look at the details of the case, unfortunately, you can see that really there's really not much written other than the fact that it says no contact missing, and unfortunately some of my some of my friends, a lot of them have more detailed information. They have people who have been to camp, how long they've been there, how many have been sentenced to prison for how many years. But this is the kind of for my family particularly, this is the kind of information that we have absolutely no way of knowing, because again, we cannot pick up our phone in this digital age and figure out, you know, where they are, what exactly is happening, who exactly is in a camp or a prison, because again, even calling them poses as a grave danger for them. Even calling them can actually land them in a camp or prison. So I'm going to keep going to show you how this list just kind of unfortunately keeps going. Then it moves on to my mom's side. You know, we deem them as missing again because there is just no way of knowing. And that's the most horrifying thing on our end, is just the fear of the unknown, right? Like, there are a lot of people in our community who actually found out years after having lost contact with their father or their mother or their aunt or uncle that they were then sentenced to prison, that they were, or that they came out of, that they were in a camp and that they came out of the camp dead. So the The next time they had heard anything about their loved one was through the news that their parent or their loved one had been killed or had, quote unquote, died in a camp. Putting quotes around died because, if China really claims for this to be a re-education program, then they shouldn't be allowing these healthy individuals to come out of these camps not alive anymore. And it continues. And again, this is just a minimum number. We have yet to be, we couldn't really go beyond, or we could go beyond this, but this is just to encapsulate, just from like the direct relatives that we know of, how many that we deem as missing. This right here, I wanted to share with you a quick story. This is one of my relatives who, he is my uncle's wife's brother-in-law, and his name is Akram Islam. And he in this photo right here, I don't know if anyone who's watching knows Mandarin or can read what the picture is saying, but essentially he's being rewarded for being one of the most distinguished Uyghur teachers in East Turkestan. He's taught middle school, was awarded by the government as one of the best instructors. And despite being seen as, a productive member of Chinese society, somebody who is well respected, he was still sent to a quote unquote re-education camp or concentration camp in February of 2018. And since then, I would say that things have gotten worse in the sense that he was not able to contact his family. His family was not able to, his family back home, his wife, they all thought he was going to quote unquote school, which is what China calls us as. But we later found out that he then got sentenced to 20 years of prison. And you might ask why, right? Like why, what was his crime? His crime was absolutely nothing. He didn't do anything other than the fact that he was sent to a camp, most possibly because his name itself is Akram, is an Arabic name. His last name was Islam, and he also prayed 5 times a day. So he did these actions, and then because of that, he was sent to a camp and now sentenced to 20 years of prison. And the charge that they have given towards him was, they said that you are inciting separatism, that you're here to disturb public order. And this is the excuse that they're using on thousands and thousands of people to sentence them to massive years of prison. And this prison typically is basically like a camp on crack, for lack of better wording, but it's essentially that. You're still being forcibly indoctrinated in these prisons. These are not normal prisons. These are not prisons where you have any basic rights or basic hygiene, or ability to even speak in your own language. And I'll talk briefly about the horrors that we've been seeing in these facilities as well. So he was sentenced to 20 years a couple months ago. A couple months ago. And again, he's just one of countless cases that we are seeing where this is the trend that we have. This is right here is my father, and alhamdulillah, like I have my direct parents, my parents and my siblings here in the United States. But this is his brother-in-law right here. It's my aunt's husband, and he came to the United States in 2000, a few years ago. He also came to attend my cousin's wedding in 2014, and then came again to see if he could start a new life here, maybe start up a business. Unfortunately, things didn't really pan out the way he was thinking, and he actually went back unknowingly and naively, thinking it's going to be okay. And this was before these concentration camps really became a thing, so he had no idea what was coming for him. Upon his arrival at the Beijing International Airport, he actually immediately gets detained and then sent to a camp. And since then, that's all we've heard of him. We don't know if he's still in this camp, if he's been sentenced to prison. And meanwhile, his wife and his kids were actually waiting for him at the airport. He never came out. And his wife is actually a judge in East Turkestan as well. She did nothing. She was not able to do anything to release him. And again, his crime was that he had went abroad. And what they claim is that what China claims is that this is going abroad is connects you to the diasporic activity, to possible terrorist activity, and therefore we have to make sure to quote unquote re-educate you and restore yourself to your normal mind. And these are exact words that the CCP uses, and I'll show you in just a bit. And then this is a couple other relatives who also came to the United States. This is one of my aunt's husband. This is his brother who came to the United States to attend my cousin's wedding as well. He was sentenced to 15 years of prison. And then this is his daughter, who was also unfortunately sent to a camp. And she was a PE teacher, an athlete, a really amazing woman. I remember spending really, like, just having really great memories with her in Virginia and just having a good time. And when I found out the news that she's been in a camp, like, the first thing that came to my head was just imagining the forms of torture and possible rape that the women are going through. And again, we don't know. And also the fact that she's most likely become modern day slave at this moment. And this is just a few pictures of some of the people that have been missing. But again, this list continues. So the photo that you saw in the very beginning is stemming from this exact photo that the Chinese government shared. You can see the WeChat, marker here, and China's shameless advertising of this photo, saying, "Hey, we're actually protecting you guys, protecting China from these people who are deemed as dangerous." And I think there was actually some people had taken this photo and was able to identify some of these men, and the occupations. One, I think, was a bus driver. One was, someone who just had a shop, like very ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives, and this is now their fate. And again, this was in 2017, so it's been around 4 years since this photo has been released, unfortunately. Here, I want to show you guys a quick, a quick script or excerpt of what a Communist Chinese Party official had said in response to what was happening. So they were getting a lot of, criticism, and this is what they said in terms of, like, why people are being sent to these camps in the first place. I'm not going to read through all of it. I just have some highlighted sections I want to point out. But basically, they claim that these people who've been sent to these camps have been infected by an ideological illness, and that if we do not eradicate religious extremism at its roots, the violent terrorist incidents will grow and spread all over like an incurable malignant tumor. And that is why they must be admitted to a re-education hospital in time to treat and cleanse the virus from their brain and restore their normal mind. And this is all part of a comprehensive rescue mission to save them. Keep in mind, this was actually stated way before coronavirus became a thing, and they're claiming that Islam is essentially a virus that needs to be eradicated from its roots. And so this is their way of, and subhanAllah, before using the whole terrorist narrative as a way to justify, they actually claimed that this occupation is taking place because, they would never say the word occupation, but they said we are coming into this land for development and to help alleviate poverty. Interestingly enough, Pakistan's Imran Khan actually made a tweet today congratulating China for successfully eradicating poverty almost completely. And so I just found that really interesting that basically China is carrying out its genocide through these excuses and these colonial narratives. So kind of just to recap a little bit on how exactly this meets the conditions of genocide, I want to point out these 5 conditions, right? And then go through each one. And again, these people might actually contest this, or they might think this is too much of a conclusion to make. We know it's a cultural genocide, but how do we know it's a physical genocide? Well, the first condition for it to be considered a genocide is killing. This includes, and unfortunately, through killing, we have evidence of organ harvesting, forced abortions, killing of newborn babies, right? There's actually multiple official reports that talk through, for example, the killing of newborn babies. A lot of times women, because China has this birth policy, as more specifically on Uyghurs, you cannot have more than 2 kids in most places in the city. If you have more than 2 kids, and you happen to be pregnant a 3rd time, even if you're carrying to a 9-month term, China will actually take the baby from your womb and actually just kill it on the spot in the hospital. Unfortunately, this two-child policy thing is probably not really functioning as much anymore because the birth rate has actually been plummeting in the past 2 years. The birth rate has decreased by 50%. Through, again, and this connects to the last condition, is happening through forced sterilization of Uyghur women and men. Specifically, and these people who are in the camps and prisons are more likely to be subject to this as well. And then you have the deliberately inflicting on the group conditions, which bring about physical destructions in whole or in part. You have multiple, you have, for example, forced DNA tests on the majority of population, mass surveillance, to the point where you even have Chinese officials living inside your home to make sure you're not engaging in religion, to assess your political activity, and to overall just drive you crazy. And basically, not be able, basically, I remember some people who had just fled telling me that living in East Turkestan felt like you're suffocating every day, but you're not actually dying. And if suicide wasn't haram, that suicide would be the first thing that they would go towards, because it's just so hard to live under that oppression and not be able to flee, and also not be able to say anything, to even resist without being then tortured or subject to death. So and then there's criminalizing all acts of worship and daily activities. That's in reference, kind of reference what I just talked about. But it's to the point where you can't even say Assalamu alaikum. You can't even say the word Allah without having to replace it with Xi Jinping or the CCP. So instead of saying Inshallah, you have to say Insha CCP or Insha Xi Jinping. A couple times we've heard of stories in our community, and even my circle as well, where we heard about people passing away in East Turkestan. Typically, we'd be able to send a message like Inna Lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, or may Allah grant them a place in Jannah. You can't even say something like that as somebody abroad, because sending a message like that would put them in danger. So instead of saying may Allah grant them Jannah, you say something along the lines of you gotta get rid of the Allah and then the Jannah. So you gotta say may he be in a good place. Right? Like you got to kind of secularize it, or make it not pertaining to any religion whatsoever. Causing serious bodily and mental harm to the group. Well, there's mass evidence of torture, drugging of prisoners and detainees, forced medications, forced labor. And unfortunately, now systematic, there was a couple of reports that were released in the past couple months really shedding light on systematic rape that has taken place in these prisons. And these Uyghur women describe these horrific accounts. And honestly, I couldn't even pull myself to read the whole thing, just because it was just way too much for any person to even digest and to stay healthy after reading that. And I encourage you all, for those who didn't, see that article, to look it up on BBC. You can type in BBC Xinjiang or East Turkestan Uyghur rape report. You can kind of imagine the horrors that take place in these facilities just through that one document. And then finally, forcibly transferring children to the group. So we have an estimated 500,000 or more children whose parents are in these camps, and who have been sent to state-run boarding schools or orphanages. Even though their parents may still be alive, they still call them orphanages. And then they're also kind of subject to their own, it's kind of like a kid version of a camp. Like, you are subjected to forced assimilation, are taught to hate your own religion, identity. And you can imagine the trauma of these kids. They don't know what's happening. All of a sudden they're separated from their parents. Typically daycares, you go home to your family at the end of the day. But these daycares are basically closed facilities. There are journalists who've actually visited the region in secret, or kind of tried to capture some of what these facilities look like. You see barbed wire around these facilities, and how these kids never go home at the end of the day. Because I find now at that point, there is no home to go to, because their parents are actually in prison or in these camps. Okay, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to wrap up and inshallah get to the what you can do portion, because I know that's something that everyone tends to have a lot of questions on. But I wanted to share with you quickly a depiction of some of these camps through satellite imagery. This is one of the bigger camps that you can see. If you actually type in this longitude and latitude on Google Earth, you should be able to see this. I did this myself one time, and it was just like a very jarring, haunting experience. And to be able to zoom in and just kind of imagine like your loved ones in these closed facilities with such high security, it really just makes everything, it hits you in a very different way. But you can see the area is around 519,000 square meters. And then you have like the police buildings on the far left to administer these facilities as well. This is a picture of what used to be Sorry, it was a camp facility that was then tripled in size within 3 years. So you can see the expansion of these camp facilities. And keep in mind that when this mass incarceration started in 2016, more specifically in 2017, you start to see that because so many people were being incarcerated day by day, China then actually transformed schools, libraries, government buildings, workplaces into these camps. So you can see what used to be a middle school in 2017 being transformed into a detention camp in 2018. You can see that this used to be like a soccer field. This is now a row of camp prison cells, and then possibly, and then there's a lot of these camps that have been expanded into also including factories, so that these camp detainees can become modern day slaves, or people who are working with forced labor for a lot of the clothing and merchandise that we may be purchasing today. I'm just going to skip through this, but I wanted to this is another camp facility that was found in Gansu, and it's basically made so that if somebody were to escape this, by the time they reach any kind of civilization, because it's in the middle of a desert, that person would basically die and not make it anywhere. So, and this camp can hold up to 1 million people at once. This was actually an advertisement on a Chinese website advertising what they call dark brown virgin Xinjiang human hair. There was a report talking about on CNN talking about how China seized, I believe, 800 tons of human hair products from East Turkestan, most likely coming from female prisoners. And this also corroborates the testimonies that we get from Uyghur women who happen to be released or was released by another government because they happen to be a citizen of another government, and talking about how all the women's their heads were shaved or the hair was cut off. And now China is now profiting off of this genocide by either, making them into forced laborers, selling off their hair, and just completely removing any kind of dignity and a human quality for our fellow Muslim people. This is a document shedding light on ways and reasons you could be sent to a camp. And this is actually posted by Human Rights Watch report in 2018. And this is just like some of many reasons you could be sent to camp, but just so you guys have an idea, I'm not going to read through all of it, but I wanted to point out a couple of them of how ridiculous some of these reasons are. Actually, all of these reasons are, but one of them could be inviting more than 5 people to your house without registering with the police, praying, fasting, having a WhatsApp, having too many children, wearing a full beard, eating breakfast before the sun comes up, not letting officials take your DNA, watching a video filmed abroad, not letting officials scan your irises, speaking with someone abroad. And we know of many people who've been sentenced to prison because they simply spoke with their loved one abroad. And even sending money abroad. That's another one that is huge. And we know of people, I know one aunt who, one lady who was sentenced to 7 years of prison because she sent like $250 to her brother in Turkey as an Eid gift. And her brother regrets, he blames himself for it every single day, saying, why did she have to send that money? And like, if it was, I would rather switch places with her and have myself be in a prison cell than her, because it's his beloved sister. You obviously can't imagine your own loved one, especially your female loved one, being in such a horrific setting as the prisons and camps that we see in East Turkestan. And then the forms of torture are, I'm not going to go through each one. You can kind of read through it and have it. I feel like you can easily picture the types of horror that people kind of go through, but there are actually a lot of really great reports out there that talk through these details. So, and there was a report on the New Yorker that it kind of walks you through an animated version of a lot of these accounts, and it almost feels like you're walking through a horror animation movie. I'd encourage you guys to look that up. It was just posted a couple of days ago, and you can just type in East Turkestan or Uyghurs on the New Yorker, and then it should show up, inshallah. But this is a picture of a tiger chair, or an illustration of a tiger chair. Multiple survivors had mentioned that they were forced to sit on this chair for hours on end until they confessed, or they did whatever the Chinese government was wanting them to do. Okay, so I'm gonna try to wrap up because there's a lot to go through, but I would encourage you guys to also read through the story of Mihrigul Tursun. She is a former camp survivor as well, currently living in Virginia. She had triplets, and unfortunately, one of her babies died under the hands of the Chinese authorities while she was in this camp. And during her time in this camp, she witnessed 9 women die in front of her during the 3 months she was detained. In her camp, in her cell alone, there were over 60 women cramped up and subject to horrific conditions. It's really hard for me to kind of speak on this over and over again because it's like it almost induces like secondhand trauma, so I try to avoid it. So I encourage you all to look into this, and you can read this excerpt if you want. Screenshot this really quick to talk about one instance that she saw of one of her former cellmates who where she obviously it was believed that she ended up dying, but the kinds of, just so you can picture like the kinds of the reason that people are sent to this camp. She was sent to a camp because this lady was sent to a camp because she went to attend an Islamic wedding, and then eventually came out of this camp unconscious and never came back. And I wanted to point out that the people of East Turkestan, the most ordinary people are sent to these camps, but also even being famous or like a popular scholar or a professor, someone who's deemed as a really amazing influence for Uyghur society or for Chinese society, is also subject to this incarceration. It doesn't save you from being subject to this oppression. So we have Abdullah Ayub. He's a Uyghur artist who's basically like the Uyghur version of Justin Bieber. He disappeared in 2018, and since that we don't know his whereabouts and what his condition is. So again, and he actually has music that encourages Han Chinese and Uyghurs to get along. And some parts of his music is actually in Mandarin. So, even when he does make that effort to kind of, appease to the Chinese state, this still doesn't save him. All right, this is the past and present of what used to be a very famous bazaar, so you can have an idea of how many people have been erased from or have disappeared, and a lot of these homes have now been completely emptied out. This was a journalist who visited Kashgar in 2018, and she said that around 70 to 80% of adults are in some form of detention. During Jummah time, Friday prayer, the mosques are completely empty. There is nobody to be even walking around and present in these populations, or in this area. So this is a quick photo showing how these children are being forcibly assimilated as well. This is what Uyghur children used to wear if they're performing a traditional dance, and now they're being forced to wear Confucian clothing, forced to speak Chinese, and which, by the way, even Han children don't even have to do. They don't have to dress like this in their schools and most of the time. But right now they're focusing on people who are not Chinese, and they understand that the presence of Uyghur and Turkic culture and religion identity is a threat to the Chinese government. They understand that it's harder for them to maintain tight control over this region when the people themselves are strong. They have a form of identity. They have a sense of purpose, right? So how do you weaken a population? You just stamp out everything that gives you that dignity and that strength. And I mentioned before how practicing Islam is completely prohibited, to the point where even saying Assalamu alaikum can land you in like 10 years of prison. So just to, give everyone an idea of how minute this whole oppression can be on the smallest level, I just think it's important for you guys to understand the extensiveness of this. This is one man who was sentenced to prison because he had Quranic recitation audio file on his phone. One woman was sentenced to 10 years of prison because she encouraged her friend to wear a headscarf. This was posted in 2015 by the Washington Post, but China jailed one guy for 6 years because he refused to shave his beard. This guy went on a quote-unquote unsanctioned Hajj trip, which then resulted in him being sentenced to death, and then imprisoning his mom and his wife, and then I believe killing one of them and seizing over $1 million of his assets. This is what used to be a masjid, then converted into a bar. And then these are a couple masjids that have been completely demolished to the ground, can no longer be seen on satellite imagery anymore. But I'm going to just jump right into things you can do to help, because I really apologize for going over time. But just to get the conversation started, I think we can move on to Q&A after this. These are just some ideas of things that you can do in your local community. Get your universities involved, target Confucius institutes on campuses, which oftentimes are soft power hands of the CCP, pushing your local reps to designate the situation as a genocide and address Uyghur forced labor. Try to contact and push celebrities, athletes to speak up against it, because I feel like, unfortunately and fortunately, they have so much leverage and is able to influence a lot of public decisions and public opinion as well. So they could be also a good source, because I think a lot of people are really jaded as to how the governments are responding. So if we can at least target these celebrities, that could be a really good effort as well. And then organizing protests in front of Chinese embassies or bodies that can actually do something to enact change. And then also using your creative measures to do something. Everybody has their own talents and their own abilities, so there is no one method on what you can do to help. So just leaving that up to you guys, and inshallah we can close this off with Q&A, inshallah, and go from there.
Jazakallah khair wa ahsan al-jaza. May Allah bless you immensely. We could see how difficult it was for you to speak on certain things, and so may Allah bless you and give you patience and have mercy upon the people of East Turkestan. I just wanted to kick off. I mean, if anybody has any questions, we have the comment section. Just post your questions, inshallah. Some people have already asked, and we'll just try and go through as many as we can, and we have some questions as well. This one, I want to start with you, Sister Aydin. One of the things, I don't know, you tweeted this a while back, I remember. You were at one of the big Islamic conferences and you held a talk where you spoke about the current situation for the East Turkistanis, and I can't remember, but there was hardly anybody, nobody turned up, and you just spoke to like an empty room, more or less. And when we started, right today, I'll be honest, we had a very low number of people. So we sent off some messages on the WhatsApp and we got mobilized. Alhamdulillah, we've hit 37 now, but at one point we were on like 15. And I mean, I'm thinking like once upon a time, if somebody spoke about, Bosnia, or these things that were happening, the Muslims would mobilize and there would be this galvanization that would take place. There's been some real apathy in recent times. Muslims have just become more and more just disregarding of the situation and the suffering the Muslims are going through. And the East Turkestan situation is a massive symptom of that we're seeing. So I was hoping if you could just touch on, is that, and another thing is like we're Kashmiris. So for us, it should be an even more pressing issue. But within our communities, for example, the Salafi population have taken up the cause more strongly than we have. And that's, good for them because somebody's doing it, at the very least. So, I mean, why do you think this apathy has set in? And is this something that we're going to be able to remove? And just to touch on this, inshallah.
I think I have multiple thoughts came to my head when you were talking about that. Well, I think naturally as humans, we're not as connected to an issue unless it affects us directly. And that's a natural response. And it's not until like people have met an Uyghur and this Uyghur person has talked about their trauma and what they've seen that they start to like be like, oh my God, this is bad. And they have this empathy in their heart, and that's when they actually want to start getting involved. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are not like that, who don't really need to necessarily meet an Uyghur in order to kind of form that sense in the first place. But I think naturally as humans, you need something to affect you. Even Uyghurs within our community, honestly, didn't really pick up this activism or weren't as involved until one of their family members got sentenced or was sent to a camp, right? So even our own population, we were even apathetic ourselves. And it's really, really sad to see that. And, so that's my first response to that. But also secondly, I think there's a lot of misinformation going on out there, a lot of genocide deniers, a lot of, people who've obviously garnered a lot of rightful hate and kind of a lot of hate and just kind of like disapproval of the U.S. government, that when the U.S. says something about the Uyghurs, it's like, oh yeah, the U.S. is basically, it's part of their political game. They actually don't care about Muslims. And so therefore they're quick to just kind of completely shut down the whole thing and just claim that it's Western propaganda. My response to that would be talk to or listen to the testimonies of all these people, of the actual oppressed people speaking out. And you see that a lot of our claims are corroborating whatever the US or the Western propaganda is saying, or Western sources are saying, right? If anything, we're actually adding more insight into it. We're saying that's actually much worse than what the media is portraying it as. So I think there's, again, multiple reasons. And then there's also the general silence from the Muslim world that you get as a result of China's economic ties with these countries, the way that they're pressuring and silencing these countries. You know, and I remember I was able to go to Palestine a couple of years ago, alhamdulillah, and to actually learn more about the occupation of Palestinians. And one thing that I noticed when I was there, we visited political prisoners, or not families of political prisoners, people who had seen just so much trauma under the Israeli occupation. I remember speaking to them after. I was like, I just want to let you know that you're not alone. Like, this is, I'm from East Turkestan. This is what we're going through, and not to play oppression Olympics, but because I just wanted to make them feel better, as in, like, you're not the only ones. And they would have no idea what I was talking about. They didn't know who I was. They had never heard about Uyghurs. They had never heard about East Turkestan. They never heard about what China was doing. And they were just like, I had no idea. And one Palestinian doctor who we were able to visit and talk to, he actually knew about the situation. He was like, I read about the situation once in the newspaper, and I realized us Palestinians are living a form of Jannah here, right? Like, at least, and subhanAllah, like, I felt bad even hearing that. I was like, okay, don't say that. Don't minimize your own pain and your own suffering, because, like, yeah, at least the adhan can play out. Like, I can hear the adhan. I can walk to the masjid without being fearful, fearing my life of being sent to a prison. At least I can come home to my wife at the end of the day. And we're not saying all every situation varies, but I remember feeling just horrible after he's saying that. But also, he put a lot of perspective, right? And and again, that shows, like, again, there's lack of information, a lot of lack of awareness, even within the Muslim occupied world. I'm not sure what it's like within Kashmir, of how many people actually know about the East Turkestan situation. I'm assuming, with what I've heard, it's, a lot of people do know about it. But again, when we're so, and also, one thing I want to mention is, also being someone of an oppressed population yourself, I feel like a lot of times, naturally, you also want to focus on, like, your priority is to free your own people first, right? You free your own family, free your community. And there's only so much that you can do as a person to try to address all injustice around the world. There's, I can't do open activism for all these other oppressed populations, because just I'm one body, one soul. And I feel like even I burn out just from talking about East Turkestan. So it's really, and that doesn't mean, again, that I have apathy towards other causes, but I think that's kind of the reality that we're seeing right now. But I would say the biggest factor is definitely the lack of information, misinformation, genocide denying, and also people just kind of being so sucked into their little bubbles. It's not until something hits them that they wake up and they're like, oh my God, like, what is happening?
And I think that's an incredibly important point that you make. I think I'll probably disagree with you slightly, actually, because when you talk about, sometimes people need to know and people need to understand, and then they kind of then actually that's when they realize, oh my God, this is actually a massive issue. I suppose actually when you talked about when you talk about oppressed populations and what have you. We talk about the the Rohingya population. There's Syria, there's Yemen, Iraq, and there's so many different issues around the Muslim world. But in my mind, and Maulana and I were discussing this before, actually, is that those are at the forefront of the Muslim, of the Muslim consciousness. Palestine is definitely at the forefront of the Muslim consciousness when we think about how long it is, how long the occupation has been. But obviously, during the presentation, both of you mentioned the decades, almost centuries worth of occupation and again, just even the fact that it's that you're able to educate us and encourage people to say East Turkestan rather than Chinese Uyghur Muslims, because that's what it becomes. I just wanted to actually touch upon your point around Imran Khan you mentioned earlier today. Is it literally just a case of because he's mentioned before, when he's been asked about the Palestinian cause, again, just to bring that back, he's been very, very critical. When he's been asked about India and the challenges there, he's been very, very, very critical. But then when he was asked about, the Uyghur population, he was just kind of like, I don't really know what's going on. I remember an interview a number of years ago where he was just completely like, oh, I don't know, I've not heard about it. And then later on he was asked again, and he said, oh, these are things we discuss in private rather than public. So, and he obviously praised China a number of times, saying they've really helped us, they've really supported us. Is it literally a case of some of our political leaders, or some of the Muslim political leaders, that just hamstrung by Chinese political party and the financial support that they provided?
100%. Even Turkey, unfortunately, like even historically, Turkey was a vocal supporter of East Turkestan, and Erdogan even visited Urumqi, the capital of East Turkestan, in 2009. He designated what was happening as a genocide. Now you fast forward to how Turkey is responding now. Unfortunately, you're starting to see the ways that China is actually infiltrating into Turkish society. They actually had a whole campaign in Turkey to put up on the bus stops, not just like the Turkish version of the location. It would also be in Chinese, in Mandarin. If you go to the Istanbul airport now, there are, instead of like usually in here in the States, you have like English translation and Spanish translation. English and then Spanish translation. In Turkey, you have Turkish and then English and then Chinese right below it. So you're starting to see this kind of like this slow creeping in of Chinese influence into Turkish society as well. And then also you have pressure. We had multiple. This is more recent news, but there were around over 50 Uyghurs or so in Istanbul who were actually raided by Turkish officials and actually detained and sent to a deportation center to possibly be deported. We haven't really had much information as to whether they've been deported back to East Turkestan or not, but this was again part of Chinese pressure. I was a fellow at TRT World, which is the Turkish radio television. One of the Turkish government's like media sites, and I was a fellow there for 2 months and trying to learn the field of journalism and do stuff there. And one of my projects was talking about the Uyghur situation. I spent 3 weeks on a video piece, and then just to be shot down at the very end. It basically wasn't published. They said we can't publish it because the Chinese embassy will put pressure, like they already put pressure on TRT World and said that we can't, we're not going to publish this. And I remember just being so frustrated, disappointed, and just like honestly so sad, because we're here these sites would actually promote that we're the voices of the voiceless, but at the same time, when it comes to certain populations, if that pressure is present, it's just completely disregarded. So unfortunately, we're living in Turkey is one of those states that are actually being one of these primary victims of this Chinese pressure due to their strong economic ties with China.
I was just watching recently. I mean, I think this is what you were talking about, the protest that happened in Turkey, where the Uyghurs came out to protest, and then the police came out and slowly broke them up. Yeah. I mean, the Chinese tendrils seem to probe very far. I was just wondering, just in respect to your own personal situation, I mean, have you had, because I know there's a video of you speaking out to the Chinese ambassador to the United States. I remember, right face to face over the table, just laying it out straight. Alhamdulillah, I mean, Allah bless you for that. But I was just wondering, have you faced opposition? Have the Chinese, you mentioned bots just before we came on, like it's like a really bad joke, but it's a real problem. Have you faced any threats or any difficulties in your own endeavors?
So compared to some of my friends, like some of my other outspoken Uyghur fellows, I have not seen that the Chinese government, so there's one fellow Uyghur person in our community, his name is Tahir Amin. He was speaking out about what he experienced in East Turkestan a few years ago when he was there. And as a result of him speaking out, they sentenced his aunt, I believe his mother as well, and like a bunch of his relatives to at least 10 years of prison each because he spoke out. Right. So alhamdulillah, I have not seen that yet from my side, but in terms of the types of pushback, obviously it's going to be everywhere. We've honestly, I feel like a lot of us have become immune to it because we're just so used to it, and we're like, they're going to say what they're going to say. But yeah, Chinese bots, even just storming into sessions like these to say whatever they're going to say. I had an event during my senior year at Duke. The MSA put up an event, and we had a whole row of students chuckling and laughing when the torture camp survivor was speaking about her experience and she was shaking, like, you know, talking about how they took away her child, and then she came back to her child 3 months later, and the child was dead. Like all these things, and you have this role of students just kind of like completely dismissing her, and then one girl in the back passing out propaganda articles claiming that whatever she was saying was a lie. And I don't want to like paint all people from China as this, because there are actually a good amount of Han Chinese who are actually very sympathetic towards the cause, but unfortunately they can't be as vocal about it, especially if they're within Chinese borders. Then they're going to be subject to a prison for speaking out. But the general response has been from people within China. It's been a result of the government's brainwashing of the people as well, and so that results in then people defending the government, and not even from Chinese people though. You also have these genocide deniers from even like these leftists or people who claim to be woke, you know, having Free Palestine in their Twitter bios, but then they're like posting like these counter arguments or trying to basically say that whatever these people, you know, whatever the US is saying about the Turkestan issue is complete propaganda. I've seen that with my own eyes, and you know, it's really yeah, it's a little unbelievable sometimes, but that's the reality.
I can add something to the earlier discussion about relations of South Asia, in particular, in Imran Khan. So, you know, there are a lot of actually Uyghur Pakistani intermarriages, especially in northern Pakistan. And there are a lot of incidences of families being separated because of this. So a wife will go and visit her family in East Turkestan and she's unable to come back. Or her kids are unable to come back and the husband is separated. So there are several cases of this. There are many articles about the situation. And of course, Pakistan is not addressing it because the Chinese money is just too powerful. So Pakistan's own citizens are being affected. Their own families are being affected, but there's no discussion of this. It entirely boils down, like when it comes to the issue of Palestine, it's a part of, you know, Pakistani Islamic identity that we care about the sort of cause. You know, when talking about Kashmir, you know, are you really a South Asian Muslim leader if you don't support Kashmir? But then this third issue, which is very geographically present as well as ideologically present because of the money, because of this pipeline that was created, because of the you know, harbor that was constructed, the port that was constructed, it's completely ignored. And we see, you know, with this pipeline that was constructed, it's really affected the Balochi population in Pakistan. There's internal conflict around this, and the same pipeline now is affecting the people of East Turkestan, you know, for the same reasons.
Ustad AbdulRahman, I mean, there was something I was reading recently when the Ottoman Empire in its last stages was declining and there was a fall. Just before the fall, there was a movement spearheaded by the Uyghur Muslim population to help some sort of revivalism. They donated immense amounts of money to try to support the Muslims, even though they couldn't do stuff themselves. The Uyghurs do see themselves, and Sister Aydin can come in as well. Historically, they've always seen themselves as an integral part of the Muslim Ummah, and they've always tried to carry that burden and move forward. And it's a case of like, you know, they've stood up for everybody else throughout, and now suddenly when they're needed, everybody's just gone quiet.
Yeah, I think if you go back, you know, even a few decades ago, you see like international Muslim letters. There was one I saw like in the 80s. There was one of those pan-Islamic organizations that wrote a letter about the oppression of Uyghurs at that time in the 80s. And you know, there were signees from multiple countries on that sort of letter. And you fast forward to the present day, and none of that is happening, right? But again, the economic situation has changed in this sort of circumstance. Too often, Muslims get like easily ethnically siloed, right? I remember even attending a Kashmir event in Manhattan one time. Manhattan being, you know, New York being the most diverse city in the world, they say, right? And, you know, attending an event about Kashmir over there, and there were more non-Muslims present in support of Kashmir than there were non-South Asian Muslims, you know, in the most diverse city in the world. And that's an issue like Kashmir. Obviously, there are so many South Asians present. So we can imagine if there's ethnic siloing in this issue, then in this sort of issue, of course, as well, right? There's going to be extreme ethnic siloing. It's very sad situation. If you look at the, Sister, I can talk more about this, at the publication of countries, like lists of countries that kind of protest against China or label genocide, etc. You see many European countries. You see many Western countries that are raising their voice, right? And Muslim countries, especially from the first list of countries involved in this, were completely absent. Now I think there are a couple, but initially they were completely absent from these discussions or from these protests of the UN, etc.
I mean, Sister Aydin, your piece, you brought up the Muslim Matters article, and I read it when you wrote it at the time, and I posted it on a few, social media platforms, and people weren't happy whatsoever because Habib Ali is very prominent in our Sufi community, especially. I mean, would you mind maybe expanding slightly? What did he say exactly? Why do you think he said it? And then where did he go wrong?
Yes. Okay, so I'll walk through some of the claims that we talked through in the article. So the number one claim that he made was that's not the number one claim. The first claim that he made was that around half of Uyghurs are Muslim, and we kind of and he did actually respond shortly after, not directly towards the article, but just in general. And I'm assuming that he did see the article or saw circulation of this article. And we kind of assumed that maybe it was just a demographic misunderstanding where he probably thought that he probably thought that with the Han Chinese migration taking place, that over time that this population kind of got diluted within the Han, and so therefore we kind of just got lost in the population. So we kind of just try to give benefit of the doubt, but we still addressed it in a respectful, address it in a respectful way. And then we also talked about why that is problematic to kind of claim that we're only half Muslim, and then from there we kind of went through where we took the opportunity to kind of walk through the Islamic history and talk about the significance of Islam in the region, kind of like what AbdulRahman had briefly talked about earlier in this talk. And then another claim that he made was also that the question of Uyghur oppression is a political and not a religious one. And we found that to be, although it's slightly true in the sense that, China is carrying out a lot of this oppression and genocide to maintain tight control over the region, China is still using the war on terror to justify what they're doing. They're actually using Islam and painting it as the evil. And even if somebody is secular or somebody who doesn't practice Islam whatsoever, even if they're not Muslim, there are actually a good amount of Uyghurs who are actually not Muslim, they're Christian or of other faiths. They still use this religious notion to crack down on our East Turkistanis. And now, unfortunately, it's gone to the point, like AbdulRahman mentioned, that this oppression is now being extended towards even Hui Muslims, who are, Chinese themselves, but they just happen to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and follow the Islamic tradition. And so we kind of briefly went through that as well. And then the other claim that he had made was that the people are fighting for East Turkestan. He basically claimed that the people are fighting for East Turkestan because they do not want China to build the so-called New Silk Road, so the One Belt, One Road initiative that AbdulRahman had mentioned earlier, and that because they don't want China to become 2 times as strong as America economically, and so this whole notion or this claim really reduces the East Turkestan freedom movement to China versus America binary. Like it's really just making us seem like some kind of American pawns who are just kind of being used by the US government to fight against China. And again, delegitimizing the decades of occupation that we went through, the suffering that we went through, and like who we are as a people. And I think a lot of the followers, a lot of the listeners, because he's such a well-respected scholar and because everyone looks up to him, they're taking in everything that they're saying. He's making these comments, by the way, in a big auditorium of students, right? And this is all being recorded. It's on his channel as well. And so, we were like, if we don't address this, then people are not going to understand. And we also have an Arabic translation of this article as well. So it could also extend to the greater Arab world as well, since majority of his followers are there.
Another point that I found interesting is a claim that's made by people is this idea of there are extremist factions and Saudi affiliated and Al-Qaeda and things like that. But you mentioned, your own, I can't remember now, was it your uncle maybe, who was an award-winning educator, government affiliated? I was reading a story about an imam who was, the government used to write his khutbahs, and he ended up with 17 years in prison, just deteriorating away. So can you just nip that in the bud? That argument that people make, there's some sort of Salafist, hardcore extremist sort of population that deserves what's happening. That's irrelevant, right, to what the Chinese are doing.
thing is, China has made these claims. So they actually claim that. So there's a movement. There's a movement that they called the East Turkestan Islamic movement. And after 2001, when 9/11 happened, they claimed that there's this movement started by these Uyghurs in Pakistan, Afghanistan. They have like this little. They're like connected with the Taliban, the Al Qaeda. It was actually proven that this movement was completely false. Like if you look it up, even the U.S. government they actually put this movement or this organization into their list of terrorist organizations, and then they actually retracted it last year after realizing this was all like a complete falsehood. And although there have been movements outside of East Turkestan to fight for an independent independent East Turkestan and fight against this oppression, but honestly, there have been no successful mobilizations to do so whatsoever. But China has used these small instances, or to use these small little groups that are just coming together and trying to learn how to fight against their oppressors as a tool to say, hey, these people are terrorists, and then these people are being influenced by these people, by those within East Turkestan as well. But yeah, majority of those people who are being mass incarcerated, who are being sentenced to death, are just ordinary people, right? Like I don't, when I say ordinary people, I don't want to make it seem like somebody who is fighting for independence is not ordinary, because again, that is a rightful, and that's something that we have a right to do. And if anything, we should be doing that to you have the right to fight against your oppressors in a way that is halal and is not further oppressive towards other people. But when I say ordinary people, I'm talking about people who are not even political, right? Who are apolitical, who just want to survive and just live their day-to-day life. Those people are also being subjected as well. I have a friend in Australia. He has his wife. He was newly married in 2015, and his wife was sentenced to 7 years of prison. And he's in Australia right now. His wife happened to go back to East Turkestan to visit her family. And upon her arrival, they detained her pretty swiftly. And she was actually 7 weeks pregnant at the time. And since then, he hasn't like heard her voice, doesn't know if she's alive or dead. And the Chinese government actually claimed that she was never pregnant in the first place. But now, like, we're assuming, he's kind of assumed that either she had a miscarriage or they aborted the baby. But I just want to like highlight, like he was just kind of just a guy who wanted to live with his wife and his kid in Australia, right? And then now he's subject to this horrific reality for him. And again, he's one of millions. And most people in East Turkestan don't have family abroad. Just keep in mind that. So for those of us who are speaking abroad for our family, speaking up for our family, they're the lucky ones who even have someone to voice for them, specific, to say their name on social media and to share their story. But most people back home don't have that don't have that system. So they're honestly just rotting in these prison cells, just with nothing to vouch for their release.
I was just gonna, and I suppose it's kind of maybe a difficult question, or just kind of maybe taken away from the East Turkestan situation a little bit. And I think it's really interesting when you mention Chinese tentacles. And again, when you showed up the map, there's Tibet, there's Taiwan, and all these these other countries where China has also really tried to occupy. Tibet in particular has. They've got A-list celebrities who, Richard Gere, for example, who talks about that and talks about those kind of things there, but and the occupation there. So it's. I suppose I'm asking, what is it? Is it the fact that they really China want to suppress the Muslim population, or is it's a land grab, it's a resource grab? East Turkestan is obviously resource rich as well. As we kind of go into this sort of electrical, battery-powered revolution moving forward, and then obviously there's been continual discussions or conversations around, Biden and trying to and China saying, right, our rare earths are going to stay in China, basically.
Yeah, that's a good point. AbdulRahman, feel free to chime in if you have thoughts on this. But one thing I wanted to mention is that East Turkestan is kind of used as a guinea pig for the rest of China or the rest of the occupied territories. I would corroborate what you said when you said it's a lot richer in minerals and resources. And again, that region is so key for the One Belt One Road initiative, which is now being used so that China becomes this world economic superpower. And if you guys can, like, people who are listening can look that up and kind of get a good idea of why that land was so critical for that. And also, I think it's also just convenient because to crack down specifically on East Turkestan first, because they're using this global war on terror narrative to crack down what they're doing. Right? It's like it's so convenient. These Uyghurs are Muslim. There's been violent incidents occurring, so therefore we're going to say that everybody needs to be subject to this re-education, and again, we're starting to see some of the policies that they've been using in Turkestan and other parts of China as well. Even now, we're starting to see Inner Mongolia being subjected to people, like in schools they can't teach Inner Mongolian history, language. They're forced to speak Mandarin, and you're starting to see people resisting from this. But we're seeing that this is a lot of these policies are being extended, and also Tibet, I would say, has been a victim of this occupation for the same time period that we have as East Turkestanis, right? It's just, and Tibetans are actually, there's actually evidence of Tibetans actually being sent to these camps as well. Obviously not to the same extent that Uyghurs and other Turkic people are, but it's still there. And so China is slowly now, so you had the camp, it was focused on the Turkic people. Now you're starting to add Tibetans and Christians and Uyghur Muslims. So it's becoming this, like, really this, if you're not Han Chinese atheist, you're most likely going to be probably subjected to these surveillance. And even if you're a Han Chinese, actually, I would say that you're still subjected to a lot of this surveillance and what China is doing. But we're telling everybody that we're starting to see this even beyond Chinese borders. We're starting to see this influence. We're starting to see, and AbdulRahman, you can maybe touch on this in the way that China is kind of colonizing Pakistan in a way, right? Just even through I have some Pakistani friends who were telling me how there are some parts of Pakistan that look straight up like it's part of China, like they have the signs in Chinese, and you have like Han Chinese actually settling into certain regions and marrying some Pakistani woman, like and what that all looks like. So we're telling everybody that China's influence is getting to the rest of the world, and what we're seeing in East Turkestan is not isolated from everywhere else.
I did have a follow-up question for AbdulRahman, if you're able to comment as well.
So something to add, she mentioned about being guinea pig. So if you look very carefully, like a lot of AI companies, a lot of security and surveillance companies are very much connected with the situation. Facial recognition technology, like even those like fun app things that like recognize your face or whatever, they're all actually interconnected with the circumstance. So it is a testing ground in many ways for these types of technology. And we can only imagine what that means for future levels of surveillance, right? The sort of like nation state security system, is increasing and penetrating more and more deeply into people's lives. And this is very much like the key testing ground. People have to scan QR codes constantly. Aydin mentioned, iris scans. Like this is very much a center for that level of surveillance. And several Western companies are interconnected with that. Also, just a notion about like differences between Tibet and East Turkestan. Like Tibet has been under similar oppression for a long time. There's actually been a lot of solidarity between Tibetan activists and Uyghur activists. The difference, though, is that Buddhism has this international representation of being like happy religion, and the Dalai Lama is this nice smiling guy who like everyone loves, right? Whereas with the war on terror rhetoric, it's very easy to paint Muslims as a sort of villain, right? And it's very easy to kind of cast them aside. And not have that same level of international support that the Tibetan cause has been able to garner.
And it's a super convenient sort of double standard of like, hey, well, you can't blame us because you're doing the same thing in wherever it is, Afghanistan, and dropping bombs in various parts of Africa or whatever it is.
Can I also add that Modi is also, I believe, planning to build detention camps for 1.7 million Muslims. So these models of camps are also now being replicated in other parts of the world.
And I think for me that brings, and again, I don't know if people have heard of I can't remember the name of the poet, but there's a famous poem, especially around after World War II. First they came for first they came for whoever, and I didn't say anything. Then they came for the academics, and I didn't say anything. Then they came for this, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up for me. And for me, this sounds very, very similar. The occupation continues, and it is pushed. And I would definitely recommend people, if they've not heard of the One Road, One Belt initiative, to spend. I mean, that's worth probably a YouTube rabbit hole, just to try and understand how that's affected, especially Pakistan, and the huge amount of resources that China have put into that, to be able just to basically get their resources to sea. I think I read something recently as well about a cargo train line that was going to connect Pakistan, Iran to Turkey. And no doubt that would be part of that as well, to try and get Chinese resources across, into Europe and what have you. But again, I think that's incredibly important to know that this isn't an occupation that is specifically for Muslims, and the Chinese tentacles are across the continent, across Africa, across the Middle East. And it's important for non-Muslims to be aware of this particular issue as well, because it may well end up affecting them as well.
I just wanted to, I realised that we've been running for nearly 2 hours now, so I don't want to keep you for much longer. But you mentioned the idea of what people can do to help. And I thought maybe we could just come back on that point. I mean, I'm assuming there's refugee populations, there's populations in Kazakhstan, in Turkey, in America. I don't know if there's, I'm not 100% sure, there might be populations in Britain as well of refugees who've escaped, who are still at risk because China's, as we spoke, the tentacles are still probing. And also, I mean, so that's one thing. And the second, the idea of the boycott, when the blasphemy, when Macron said or did whatever he did about saying Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Ummah sort of galvanized itself, and the boycott was very powerful. The foreign minister ends up in Azhar trying to, I'm sorry or whatever. I mean, the power.
And same with Israel, BDS movement.
The BDS movement as well. So the idea of the boycott, and I think especially for Pakistanis, because I know loads of guys posting, oh man, there's this housing project I've got in Gwadar Port, so can you guys please all come in? And people are investing in Chinese projects and things like that in Pakistan. Huawei phones, I don't know, a lot of these things, the idea of the labor camps that American companies are utilizing in China for Uyghur Muslims. I mean, so in terms of how we can help, could you, the refugees boycott and a few of those things, could you just expand on those, inshallah, maybe?
I just noticed, actually, sorry, very quickly, that wasn't something that you'd actually mentioned in your presentation about the boycotting, but it was very much about activism.
Right. Sorry, I didn't meant to. Boycotting was meant to be put in there. I apologize. That wasn't. I think it was just supposed to be like some ideas, but yeah, boycotting is definitely one of those action items that we deem as really important. I think targeting China's economic power is probably one of the most effective ways, although getting there might seem like it's impossible or very much of a unrealistic goal. So beyond just boycott, so like a lot of times, like I went shopping last week and it was so hard to find a gift that I was trying to buy something for a friend who just had a baby, and I was like having such a hard time like not picking up something that was said made in China, because I was like, I'm not gonna give someone something that was possibly made by my loved ones with their blood and tears, there are also a whole list of companies, not just American companies. If you go on Uyghurs for Sale, ASPI's report, that have used forced labor, and that within East Turkestan. And so some of these companies off the top of my head include Nike, Adidas, Victoria's Secret, Carter's, the company that makes baby clothes. And there's tech companies. There's actually been a report, though, alhamdulillah, that with increasing pressure, 12 Japanese companies actually cut off their ties from forced labor. So some of these include, I believe, Uniqlo, and a few other ones as well. And so I apologize for not being able to
Of course,
just go through all of them all at once, but there is definitely a lot of hidden slavery happening within these companies. And Nike, we've actually had campaigns to reach out to them, and I would actually either deny it or say that this is not true, even though there's actually open evidence that it is. And we actually were having efforts to contact people who are in partnerships with these companies, like Ibtihaj Muhammad. She's, mashallah, a very prominent, famous representation of Muslim women, but she had a paid partnership with Nike and posted on her site, advertising the Nike hijabs. And I remember telling her, hey, this hijab could have been made by my relatives in these camps who've been raped and tortured, who are also Muslim women. Please cease your partnership. She also had a paid advertisement with Mulan, the Disney film that was released last September. Mulan was actually filmed in East Turkestan. And within the site that they were filming in, there were actually 7 camps surrounding that area, or not too far from that filming site. And the film actually gave credit towards these entities that were supporting the genocide, right? So Disney was complicit, and then we have these Muslim figures supporting and promoting these entities. So just kind of using your method, your knowledge and research to target these people in a respectful way. First, we did send private letters, but then if somebody doesn't respond, unfortunately, you have to call them out in public. But use, and then also just being a smart consumer. And also just keep in mind that when you buy something that is, people say, okay, well, things made in China are a lot cheaper. I don't want to spend this extra $5 on something else that's more expensive. Understanding that's a form of sadaqah, right? That's our way of Islamically buying, right? I feel like we think, okay, alcohol is haram, buying this is haram. Okay, well, buying something that's possibly made by slaves, I'm pretty sure that's haram as well. If there is no fatwa on it officially, then just use your mind and use your heart to be able to determine that, right? And just keep in mind that those extra $5 that you spend on something a little more expensive that happens to be made ethically is part of, it's going to come back to you in a replication. And so I remember entering a store with someone at the mall, and I was telling her hey, because she was trying to buy something from Zara, and I said Zara is using forced labor and they lied about what they're doing, and she just she was just kind of oh, sorry, but then she still entered and bought her thing. And so I was kind of shocked, how I just told you that this is a thing, but you still went ahead and bought it. So it was a little there are some people who are maybe not as I guess responsive to that, but it is part of our Muslim consciousness to have to make these small adjustments to our to fulfilling our desires.
I guess at that point it might be worth remembering Mesut Ozil, who for Arsenal, his whole career went down the drain. Now he's playing for Fenerbahce. That may Allah bless him for taking a stand and making a great sacrifice for the sake of the Uyghur Muslims. And just closing again. Are there any charities that cater for refugees, Uyghur refugees, that we could maybe advertise or point to people so they could try and help out potentially?
So there is one called Shukr Foundation. I think you guys can put up the link. They do a lot of relief work for refugees, particularly in East Turkestan. I believe they're actually based in Australia, but if you look it up, it should show up, inshallah. But I also have connections to certain organizations in Istanbul that work with, that are run by Uyghurs and also are there to serve Uyghur women, widows, orphans. And I can, if people are interested, to send those links. I don't think their websites are very developed, so it's kind of hard to donate on there. But if you want, I could send their bank information and have you guys directly donate through there, because that money directly goes to the hands of these refugees. And I think nowadays with the pandemic, people are really having a hard time supporting themselves, especially in a place like Turkey, where they are actually not recognized as refugees or or people of residence, so they can't get, a lot of times they can't get working permits or get the same types of benefits that, let's say, Syrian refugees would get in Turkey, for example. But I can definitely send those around.
So inshallah, when you send those, we'll share them with people who are interested, inshallah. I don't know if you have any more questions, but it's been 2 hours now. So I just want to thank you both again. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah reward you immensely for the time you've taken out to educate us on this incredible topic about the history of the Uyghur Muslim population, the suffering that they're enduring, and the duties that we have as an ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam upon our shoulders to be of assistance to them. We ask Allah Ta'ala to bless you and your families, and we ask Allah Ta'ala to hasten the release of your family, specifically Aydin Anwar, from the occupation and the oppression that they're having to undergo. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to have mercy upon the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, haythuma kanu, aynama kanu, wherever they may be and however and in whatever state they may be, inshallah. And on that note, subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant nastaghfiruk wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakumullah khair for putting this together.